Okay. I know my whole channel shtick is to, be positive about fighting games, but I kinda wanna be a little negative. And talk about two big blunders that I consider to be the worst main title games in the Street Fighter franchise in retrospect. Cause even though I don't necessarily like playing the games I'm about to talk about, I still find them super interesting, because of how awkward they are in the grand scheme of things. So let's start this by welcoming ourselves to the world of Street Fighter 3. But not this one, or that one, because we're exploring the very first version of Street Fighter 3, New Generation, which I feel like is mostly brought up in passing when discussing the general initial failure of the Street Fighter 3 series, but never really examined on its own for its gameplay. But before we get to that gameplay, we gotta set up how it came to fail first, cause let's be honest, there was no way that the long-awaited Street Fighter 3 could ever live up to mainstream expectations. In the 6 years between Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3's release, Capcom had helped saturate the market that they created by releasing 5 versions of Street Fighter 2, a prequel series, a 3D spin-off, a new crossover series, and a bunch of other original fighters all by themselves. And that's not counting all of the other companies flooding the arcades with their own fighters. So it's not crazy to see how a general audience was getting tired of the genre. And then of course you add the fact that the sequel to the biggest fighting game of all time replaced all of its iconic characters with a brand new roster, and then finally topped that off with very strange marketing and no home console port for 2 years. It's no wonder that Street Fighter 3 initially did very bad. But it's almost been 30 years since the game has come out. I really don't care about its sales or the critical reception of the time when revisiting now. My beef with New Generation is that it's the worst feeling Street Fighter game. Look, it's impossible to not want to compare this retroactively to Third Strike, but it's very important to know that New Generation does not play like Third Strike on a system mechanic and just a fundamental level. New Generation's physics just feel crazy and don't make a lot of intuitive sense to me. Characters get pushed back or get sent flying in ways that make the game feel very sporadic. I mean, just look at the crazy amounts of pushback that Dudley has on all of his moves. Or how Yun's dash punch shoots the opponent up into the air for some reason, which obviously looks off cause why would they be going vertical? But also because a lot of animations in this game are oddly faster than how they appear in Third Strike, because they have less frames of animation and recover quicker, making attacks much choppier. It's crazy how adding just a few more frames of animation to a move helps not only its readability, but also the emphasis on what the animation is actually trying to accomplish. Third Strike Ryu's standing heavy kick feels heavy, while New Generation Ryu's heavy kick just looks awkward. It doesn't help that a lot of moves are also spammable on whiff in New Generation, as if you could chain them for some reason, which just looks cheap to me. How choppy and fast this game is visually, of course affects the gameplay in New Generation too. Combos are kinda weird cause they feel like you have to do your inputs faster than you would think, cause there's not a lot of hit stun and there's a lot of pushback. But even if you like how the game feels and think it looks absolutely fine, New Generation is also pretty broken, but in a very boring and vanilla way to me. This game is riddled with infinites and touch of deaths that don't take a lot of skill to do, cause damage is just ridiculous here. Ryu can basically kill you with the most basic combo, and then juggle you like a versus game to finish you off. If any character lands a simple jump in on you, you're practically almost stunned or dead. But even just getting clipped by a normal or a universal overhead will leave a dent in your health bar. The big damage is almost balanced out by how goofy the parry system in New Generation is though, because parries are technically easier, even though the window to input a parry is actually smaller, because low parries in this game can actually parry mid attacks, which just makes guest parries a lot stronger. But I will admit, I do enjoy one New Generation oddity, and it's how weird air parries are in this game, because unlike Third Strike, there are 2 different versions of them. If you tap forward in the air like normal, you get this weird pushback that literally sends the characters back to neutral if you parry an air to air. But if you tap down in the air for a parry, your character literally does an air hop, which can lead to some dumb shenanigans. Now, I don't think this is better than how air parries work in the future, because the physics are not very intuitive, and also having 2 air parry windows is just ridiculous. But it is kind of funny to do. But strangely, New Generation locks the player out of doing an air parry after an air reset though, which is when an air parry would be the most useful. This essentially gives the player access to a bunch of pseudo combos that the opponent just has to eat if they get clipped in the air, which is one of the dumber oversights in this game in my opinion. Throws are also different in this game, because they're not performed by hitting light punch and light kick like Third Strike, but by holding a direction and buttons like the old man games that came before it, which I know a lot of younger fighting game players can't stand, but doesn't bother me at all, except for the fact that there is no throw teching in this game, which is pure insanity game design, especially since Super Turbo had this mechanic 3 years before this game. But hey, if you'd rather deal with strong option select grabs than Kara grabs, I won't blame you. But okay, it's not all awful, because there are some cool things about New Generation, mainly the stages. They are lively and gorgeous, and the stage transitions are something that I wish had made it all the way to Third Strike. I also love the windscreens, and New Generation's soundtrack is fantastic, with its arranged soundtrack being one of my favorites ever. But that doesn't save it for me. Street Fighter 3 New Generation is just a very messy and obviously rushed game. For some reason, Capcom put together a team that had no prior experience working on fighting games to create the sequel to Capcom's biggest game ever. And a lot of that shows here, because beyond the weirdness and gameplay, there's also the fact that there are no EX moves in this game at all, which makes a lot of characters really boring. Yun and Yang are not just twins, but basically clones that share a moveset with very slight differences. And an almost finished Hugo is still accessible in the code of the game. Thankfully, just 7 months later, Capcom would release the second version of Street Fighter 3, titled Second Impact, and remedy a lot of the general jank that plagued New Generation. And just 2 years after that, Third Strike would be released, and end up being one of the most influential titles in the entire genre, which feels like an impossible miracle when revisiting New Generation. I still think Second Impact is worth revisiting and playing today, because it's still very different from Third Strike, and still very competent for the most part. While I think New Generation just feels like a beta test that can ultimately be skipped. Street Fighter 3 had a lot going against it outside of the game, but at the end of the day, New Generation also just plays pretty badly, and wasn't up to the Capcom gold standard then, and now. But hold on. I don't know where else to fit this in, but I have to show off the fact that Sean can punch fireballs for some reason in this game. I don't know if this is intentional or a glitch, so I don't know, maybe this game actually is good and I was wrong. Jokes aside though, while New Generation is definitely an outwardly kinda bad game, I actually take more offense to the next game I'm gonna discuss, because it does something worse than being bad in my opinion. It's boring. So we find ourselves at the end of 1993, and the arcade fighting game market is booming. SNK has started 3 popular fighting game franchises, Sega has released the mind-blowing Virtua Fighter, and Midway already has 2 Mortal Kombats under their belt, while Capcom was still riding on the Street Fighter 2 train for almost 4 years at this point. Which hey, is absolutely fine for a fighting game sicko like me. Keep pumping out those revisions. But the Street Fighter 2 fatigue was definitely hitting, and people wanted something new. But don't worry, the successor to the CPS-1 arcade hardware that Street Fighter 2 ran on, aptly named the CPS-2, was coming. And this thing was a major upgrade to the CPS-1 in almost every way. So how did Capcom choose to show off this brand new hardware? With another damn revision of Street Fighter 2 of course. Super Street Fighter 2, The New Challengers, is the 4th revision of Street Fighter 2, and its big draw is of course the new challengers themselves. This game added DJ, T-Hawk, Fei Long, and Cammy to the cast, as well as introducing an arranged soundtrack and revised presentation that takes advantage of the new CPS-2 hardware. This includes new portrait sprites, redrawn endings, new attack animations for the bosses, new special moves, a combo counter, new colors, and even a brand new intro, which is incredibly iconic and so cool. But ultimately hypes up a snooze fest, cause the main issue with this game is that it is so slow. You see, the previous version of Street Fighter 2, titled Hyper Fighting, revolutionized Street Fighter by speeding the game up by a lot, which was done in response to the growing amount of bootleg Street Fighter 2 hacks that were entering the market, that modified the gameplay in various different ways, one of them just making the game faster. And I can't understate how much the general audience loved this new flow of gameplay that Hyper Fighting introduced. which is what makes new challengers so confusing, because Capcom went back and hit the brakes, making Street Fighter slow again. It doesn't matter that new challengers had 4 more characters to play with. It doesn't matter that it rebalanced a lot of the mechanics and toned down a lot of the ridiculousness the earlier versions of Street Fighter 2 had. And that fresh coat of paint certainly doesn't matter when the core experience itself feels like a huge step back. And Capcom knew this, because just 5 months, 5 months after New Challengers was released in the arcades, Capcom would make operators buy a whole nother revision of the game that has thankfully stood the test of time, the legendary Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which of course sped the game way back up, and also introduced supers, and juggles, another revamped presentation, and of course Akuma. Just another silly Capcom beta test that cost arcade operators hundreds of dollars, I guess. But I think the true testament to the failure of New Challengers is that it has no current day scene whatsoever. Every other arcade version of Street Fighter 2 has lore surrounding it, and a competitive scene that plays it to this day. Champion Edition has fans because it's so cheap and evil. There are many purists out there that believe Hyper Fighting is the last true Street Fighter. Super Turbo is the granddaddy fighting game that will be played forever, and even the very first version of Street Fighter 2 is played as a historical piece, also because we now know it's funny and broken. But New Challengers doesn't have any of that. This game is stuck between the definitive CPS-1 version of Street Fighter 2 and the definitive CPS-2 version of Street Fighter 2, with really nothing to offer on its own, as everything it did have was greatly improved in Super Turbo. And you can even select pseudo versions of the New Challengers characters in Super Turbo that retain the mechanics and some of the balancing from New Challengers, making the game even more redundant. Also, I just learned this while making this video, but apparently in Hyper Street Fighter 2, which is a version of Street Fighter 2 that lets you select characters from every other version of Street Fighter 2 with their balancing intact, the New Challenger versions of characters have one extra frame of hit stun that every other version does not have, meaning they get comboed harder than the other characters. This game is cursed, man. The home console ports of New Challengers would add the ability to change the speed, making the game more fun, but sadly these are not definitive ports whatsoever. So it really does feel like a lost version, and to me proves that sometimes it's better to be bad than boring, because at least being bad is memorable. I'm sorry y'all had to see Mr. Windquote get so negative, but ultimately it doesn't even really matter. Both of these games were almost immediately replaced with something much better, and we can now appreciate these for what they really were. Rushed and expensive location tests for new hardware. It was scummy and very anti-consumer, but did lead the way to some of the greatest games of all time. So, I don't know, it was worth it, I guess? Shoutouts to all of the arcade owners and arcade goers who had to drop mad money on bad games so we could eventually get good ones. The moral of the story is, I guess, don't put the word new in the name of your fighting game. Also, just play what you want. Alright, thanks.